RU46 is billed as a safe and easy alternative to surgical abortion. I'll talk with medical expert Dr. Harrison to get the true facts. We'll hear from those working to protect women from this chemical abortion drug, and I'll visit with a woman who shares her personal story about her direct experience using RU46. Rebecca is a mom and wife. She's also a survivor of the chemical abortion drug RU46. Since the FDA approved this series of pills, there have been 10 known deaths associated with taking this drug. Rebecca, what led you to take RU46?
In July of 2 years ago, I was 18 weeks pregnant with our 5th child. And on the 4th of July, I just wasn't really feeling very well. And so the next morning, I went to my midwife and I said, I explained to her the kinds of pains I'd been having. And she did an ultrasound and discovered that our baby had died probably about a week before. If we waited for things to go naturally, it could take up to 2 weeks for me to go into labor, which I just really didn't think was kind of what I wanted to do. If we had done it surgically, there was a significant risk of damage to my cervix, which, considering that we would like to have a big family, that just wasn't really an option for us. And the way that the RU486 was described to me was that it would be kind of a gentle, easier way of doing this.
So what was the process like?
I had expected it to be like normal labor. I had already had 4 children. I kind of thought it would be reasonable to expect it to be normal labor. The contractions do not feel like normal contractions. Where a normal contraction compresses down, the pain of an RU486 or a Cytotec contraction actually expands outward. You just feel it in your whole body. I ended up with a horrible migraine headache. Every time I had a contraction, it just kind of felt like behind my eyes was exploding. The labor was really bad. About an hour into it, I started passing blood clots. They varied in size from really small, but most of them were up to probably the size of my hand. The majority of them were the size of a chicken egg. And it was just one after another, and any time that I would move, stand up, or have a really strong contraction, there would be more and more blood coming out. The nurse was coming in every 20 minutes to change the surgical padding that was underneath me.
Since 2001, Dr. Donna Harrison has been studying the effects of the drug from both a physical and political point of view. The New York Times published an op-ed piece written by Dr. Harrison in November of 2004 when the FDA announced it would strengthen the warning label for RU486. Tell me how RU486 works.
Well, RU486 works by blocking 2 different kinds of receptors, progesterone receptors and glucocorticoid receptors. Progesterone receptors are receptors for a hormone that is in a woman's body that's responsible for that beautiful symphony of that allows her to produce an egg and cycle through the month. Glucocorticoid receptors are all over the body, and they're responsible for stress response to the body. They're in the adrenal glands, and as I said, in immune cells. They're basically throughout the body. So RU486 blocks both receptors, and it prevents the normal functioning of the body. What it does to a woman who's pregnant is that it causes the part of the woman's body called the placenta that's feeding the placenta from the baby. It causes that part of the woman's body to shrink and to atrophy. It causes the blood vessels to die, so that the developing fetus, the baby, starves. When RU486 is present and it kills the fetus doesn't always pass then, and that's why the need for a second drug called misoprostol or Cytotec. That's why Cytotec is used then to cause the uterus to squeeze down and push out the baby who's dead.
So how did you take it? Was it an oral application?
I actually took it orally and vaginally in the hospital under a doctor's supervision. I had said to them, they said it could take up to 24 hours for me to go into labor, and so I said, could I go home? after being given the drug, and the doctor at that time said to me that was not an option because I had a significant chance of bleeding to death. So I stayed in the hospital.
When we return, the president of Concerned Women for America, Wendy Wright, talks about the inadequate studies conducted on RU46. In 2000, the FDA approved the use of RU46, often called the French abortion pill, to be available in the United States. Since then, this so-called little white pill has uprooted hundreds of thousands of lives. Wendy, is RU46 dangerous to women?
RU46 is extremely dangerous, and in fact the FDA knows it. The Food and Drug Administration, when it approved the drug, only was able to do it by ignoring the fact that the studies that were done on it were substandard, that there was fraudulent data in those studies. For example, convulsions were reported as fainting. Women who had serious complications from RU46 in the trials, their experience was not accurately reflected in the data and the statistics that were given to FDA. The FDA knew this and yet still allowed for it to be approved. Since it's been approved in the United States, there are a number of women who have died, and died from things that had not come up even in the trials. For example, a number of women died from a very rare bacterial infection, Clostridium sordelli. It's a bacteria that many women have in their bodies. About 10% of women have it, but it's no big deal because our immune system fights it off. But what appears to be happening is that RU46 suppresses the woman's immune system.
There has been some significant research done on the effect of RU46 on infections in animals, and it turns out that if you take a certain strain of mice and you give them RU46, that lowers their ability to fight off an infection significantly. In fact, if you take a certain strain of mice and you give them a wound that's contaminated, you will have a certain percent of those mice die, somewhere between around a third. If you give them RU46 first and then you give them the same wound, it's 100% mortality. And that's a significant difference because RU46 actually acts on the immune cells of the body by a certain receptor called a glucocorticoid receptor. It's the same receptor that the stress hormone cortisol works on. And when RU46 interferes with that glucocorticoid receptor, it blocks the ability of the immune system to fight off infections.
Once the bacteria gets into her bloodstream, there's nothing that any doctor can do to save her life. It's fatal. And so this information has not been adequately told to women, even now, even though it's known, even though the FDA and the Centers for Disease Control held a workshop in Atlanta regarding this rare bacterial infection that's associated with taking RU46. Even though it's being investigated and researched, women are not being told this before they take the drug.
Rebecca was administered the drug under hospital supervision, but she still didn't feel like it was a safe method to induce her miscarriage. Now, what were some of the short-term effects?
After we had delivered the baby and the placenta, and I got up to go to the bathroom, and I was so weak that I actually collapsed and fainted in the bathroom and hit my head on the wall. And had my husband not been in the room, would not have been able to call for help, and was too weak and groggy and disoriented at that time even to talk to anyone, and it was probably an hour before I would have been able to call for help for myself.
Now, what were some of the long-term effects?
I was very lethargic, very weak. I was anemic, severely anemic, so that my doctor put me on iron pills. And he said that's really not at all uncommon after undergoing a procedure and using Cytotec. But that's one of the known complications of severe anemia.
Misoprostol is marketed under the name Cytotec, which is what was given to Rebecca to induce contractions and begin labor. The use of Cytotec to induce contractions is not approved by the FDA. However, it is used in the RU46 abortions and usually outside of a doctor's supervision.
The process of an RU46 abortion involves bleeding and cramping. The difficulty is when a woman takes an RU46, takes RU46, and then is sent home. She's the one that has to decide how much cramping is too much cramping, how much bleeding is too much bleeding.
How many recorded deaths have there been so far?
There have been 10 recorded deaths that we know of, but the FDA has withheld some information from us. Based on the FDA data and the adverse event reports that Dr. Peggy Gary and I analyzed, we can say that for every 100,000 mifepristone abortions, at least one woman will die from sepsis. This is a previously healthy woman who had no risk factors otherwise. We can also know that that rate is 10 times the rate of death from infection as compared to surgical abortion.
And in 2 of the cases of women who died, their bodies had already been buried. And it was only after that their families were contacted by Monty Patterson, whose own daughter died from RU46, and he said to them, do you know what it was that caused your daughter's death? And perhaps you need to have tissue samples sent to a lab to find out. 2 of those women's bodies, they were exhumed. Tissues were sent to a CDC lab, and it was only then that it was discovered that what they died from was this bacterial infection that likely was caused by their RU46 abortion. All that to say, there may be many more women who have died after taking RU46, but unless their families know to go through this arduous process of having their tissue samples sent and studied, it may never become known that the true cause of their death was this chemical abortion, RU46.
When Rebecca and her husband learned their 5th child had died in utero, Rebecca was given the option to induce labor by using RU46. It's a 2-step process of taking this drug, followed 72 hours later by Cytotec, both of which have serious side effects. You're a mother who had 4 previous...
I had 4 previous children.
So you knew what to compare this to.
Well, I thought I knew what I was looking at, and that was why I had thought actually it was reasonable to expect that I could go home, because I thought I've been in labor before, I know what this feels like, I would know when to come back, and I didn't. I had no idea that this was what it was going to feel like. I was weak and shaking and in pain.
Do you think you were well informed at all for the process?
I really don't. I don't feel like I was well informed at all. I wasn't told what to expect. I wasn't told any of the long-term ramifications. I was not even made to sign a consent form. The only forms that I had to sign were to be admitted to the hospital and for my insurance to pay.
The woman is supposed to sign an agreement that she knows that she is less than 49 days from her last menstrual period. If she is 49 days or 7 weeks, then RU46 works in the way I said and is effective in killing the fetus. However, if she's just 1 week later, the effectiveness drops off to about 85%. And if she's 1 week later than that, or 9 weeks, the effectiveness drops off to about 75%. And if she's further out than that, you're down below 50%. What does that mean for the woman? She takes RU46, she goes through the whole process, and then she ends up with a baby that's continued alive, but now exposed to a known drug, which is actually Cytotec or misoprostol. We know that that causes birth defects, but there have been cases across the country where women have not known what their last menstrual period was, and yet they're given the drug anyway. And this is a clear violation of the FDA agreement with Danco.
Danco Laboratories distributes RU46 in the U.S., but does not manufacture the drug. In fact, Danco doesn't hold the rights to manufacture or distribute the abortion drug.
But it turns out that Danco is simply a shell company. The actual right to manufacture and distribute is held by the Population Council. So since Danco doesn't manufacture or distribute anything, they don't even manufacture the drug is actually manufactured by Walin Pharmaceuticals from China, the same pharmaceutical company that has been called into question by the FDA for other things. That's who manufactures RU46, and it is then shipped to Danco, who distributes the drug, but Danco has no other product, so there's no way for the FDA to say, look, if you don't do the right thing with this drug, we're not going to give you another approval. They don't want another approval. They don't need it.
An abortion can be done in two forms, surgical abortion or chemical abortion. A surgical abortion must be performed by an abortionist at the facility. During the chemical abortion, the abortionist administers the drug and usually sends the woman home. This gives the illusion of being more concealed than a surgical abortion. Do you think it's more private for them than a surgical abortion?
She still has to go to the clinic to get the drug, so it's still the doctors, the nurses who are supposed to be involved, and then perhaps even her family members, because she's when she's at home that she'll pass the baby, so her family members may end up being more involved than they would be with a surgical abortion. What I fear, though, is that there are fewer medical professionals involved with RU46 than with surgical abortion. That is, in fact, one reason why the abortion lobby pushed for the FDA approval of RU46, because they had a problem in that there are fewer doctors willing to do abortion. So they were looking for a method in which they didn't need to have a doctor involved. Many of the women who have had an RU46 abortion report how traumatic it was for them. Now, they'll report it, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily will talk freely about it. And so that means that more women go into an RU46 abortion without knowing how traumatic it will be for them.